Alright guys, so we are trying out a little bit of a different program for the videos. The last one that I was using, Microsoft Debut, kind of stopped working for me, so I'm trying out something new with this new video. So let me know if it works. Let me know quality-wise if this is something that we can tolerate. Because this is probably what we're going to be using moving forward. But with this new product, I think it does allow me to share my screen as well, so that might be something that I play around with a little bit moving forward. But today we're going to be talking about the war in the Pacific. So, the strategy the Allies used in the Pacific to retake the Pacific from the Japanese is known as island hopping. Island hopping. The name given to Japanese suicide pilots, which translates as the divine wind, is known as kamikaze. K-A-M-A-K-A-Z-E. Kamikaze. And the top secret program set up in 1942 to develop or build an atomic bomb is known as the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project. All right, so read as a class one American story on page 770 on the Bataan Death March. So in April of 1942, more than 70,000 Filipino and American troops surrendered to the Japanese on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. From there, the Japanese marched the soldiers about 60 miles to a prison camp. On the way, about 10,000 prisoners died from shootings, beatings, or starvation. Sidney Stewart was a U.S. soldier in the Bataan Death March. And this is a quote from him in his book, Give Us This Day. The sun beat down on my throbbing head. I thought only of bringing up my feet up, putting them down, bringing them up, and so on. A great many of the prisoners reached the end of their endurance. The dropouts fell by hundreds in the road. There was the crack of a pistol. There was another shot. And more shots, and I knew that straggling along behind us was a cleanup squad of Japanese that was killing their helpless victims. I gritted my teeth. Oh God, I've got to keep going. I can't stop. I can't die like that. As you'll read in this section, the fighting was brutal before the Allies emerged victorious. So the Bataan Death March is the beginning of this conflict. So kind of right after Pearl Harbor, after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese are going to launch an invasion of the Philippines. So we've talked about the Philippines before as an American possession, part of this imperialism that was going on, and it's still under American oversight at this time. They're their own independent nation, but there are still a bunch of American soldiers that are there as sort of like peacekeepers that are making sure things are going well. So they're there, but it's the geography of the Philippines that really kind of ends up being majorly problematic for the United States and for Japan, because their colonial ambitions made them want to take places like Indonesia, which is just to the south of the Philippines, take Indochina, French Indochina, which is just to the west of the Philippines. So they have all these goals of places they want to take, and they know that this is going to bring them in conflict with the United States, right? Just simply from geography. So that is the reason why they attacked Pearl Harbor, to take out the Navy, so that then the Navy could not support as Japan invaded the Philippines. And that is exactly what happens. Okay? So Japan expands its empire. So at the same time as Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched attacks throughout the Pacific. By the end of 1941, they controlled Hong Kong, Thailand, Guam, and Wake Island. So if you recall, Guam and Wake Island are American possessions. They are things we got from the Spanish at the end of the Spanish-American War, and now they have been taken by the Empire of Japan. So Japan then pushed into Southeast Asia and even Malaya and Burma. It took Japan longer to take the Philippines, and the reason for that is twofold. Right? So the first is the presence of U.S. forces. Right? So General Douglas MacArthur is hanging out there and that's MC and then ARTHUR, is there with U.S. and Filipino troops to fight off the Japanese. So that presence is going to be the first reason why it is more difficult to take the Philippines, and the second reason is the geography of the Philippines. Right? It is a archipelago of over 1,000 tiny little islands that you have to invade and clear each island before you can move on. So that is a logistical nightmare for a invading army to take. In terms of General Douglas MacArthur, we have heard about him one other time. So he is the guy that is in charge of clearing out the bonus army back in the Great Depression. So he is the general that kind of orchestrates that, gets a little bit of a negative name for himself in doing that, loses some of the respect of veterans, but in World War II, he's going to be the guy in the Pacific. Right, so it's he and Admiral Nimitz that are going to be kind of running things in the Pacific. However, FDR was worried that the Japanese would invade Australia. Okay, so Australia is still kind of loosely affiliated with England. They still recognize the King of England as their sovereign, even though they have their own system of government, their own independence. They're still part of the Commonwealth of England. And the interior of Australia is home to a lot of natural resources that would certainly be beneficial if the Japanese had managed to take it. So, with their southward progression, moving through Indonesia, the aspirations to invade Australia were pretty apparent. And the Japanese are going to target Australia for an invasion, but will be prevented from doing so. And part of that is because FDR orders MacArthur to retreat to Australia. So he orders him to sort of abandon the Philippines and the soldiers that were there and to go to Australia. And so because of this, MacArthur was not happy because he felt that he was leaving his own men behind. And he kind of was. Right? So these men are going to suffer pretty considerably on the Bataan Death March. So Bataan is a peninsula in the Philippines, and the march that takes place there is through dense jungle. They're not going to be given food. They're going to be not given good water. So a lot of people died from exhaustion or straggled behind, as we read about, from exhaustion, and then were then shot and killed because of this. So both the Filipino soldiers and the American soldiers that are there as sort of peacekeepers are going to suffer through this. And I've actually met a guy that lived through the Bataan Death March. His name was John Plater, and he wrote a book called Survivor that I read when I was probably in either late middle school or early high school, about his experiences with the Bataan Death March, and then they were going to be shipped from the Philippines to Japan. They were on a boat, but then that boat got sunk by a American submarine, and so then they had to survive on an island until they were rescued. And it's a really amazing story from his experiences as a prisoner of war to the Japanese Empire, and the brutalities that occurred in that theater. So MacArthur utters the line as he leaves the Philippines and says, "I shall return." Okay, I shall return. I'm being sent to go off to Australia now to defend that northern shoreline of Australia, but I shall return. I will come back. We will retake the Philippines. We will rescue our soldiers, and we will end the Japanese occupation of the islands. Okay. So, as far as the Allies turning the tide in the Pacific, there are three major battles that we're going to look at here. So, Doolittle's Raid, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Battle of Midway. So, Doolittle's Raid it happens pretty much right after Pearl Harbor. So, Pearl Harbor is this massive sort of morale shift for American soldiers and for the American public because we'd been attacked. It was this surprise attack, and nobody saw it coming. So there was a call for retaliation in America that we need to strike back. And so the guy that does this is John Doolittle. So what was it? This was retaliation for Pearl Harbor, and it is a aerial bombardment or raid on Tokyo. Okay, it's a raid on Tokyo. So this takes place early in 1942. Yep. Spring of 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 bombers in the attack. And the significance of this is that it was a morale blow to Japan. But from a logistical standpoint, this is incredibly difficult because at this point in time, America does not have any long-range bombers. This is before the advent of the B-16, it's the B-15s, and the later war bombers that are able to travel in excess of 1,000 miles. So these bombers had to be launched from aircraft carriers, which was something that had never been done before. Okay, because aircraft carriers typically have a much shorter landing strip than a typical airport would. So they had to strip these bombers down to the absolute bare minimum. Right, so like they took out all the seats, they took out everything that was non-essential as far as targeting arrays, they took out everything that was non-essential as far as radio and controls, so that they were just a yoke, basic radio, fuel, wings, engines, and bombs, and the crew to man them all. And that's about it that these 16 bombers are equipped with, because they had to lighten the load enough that they were able to take off over this short runway to carry out this raid. So the pilots that trained for this did so in Kansas, I believe, and they trained on shortened runways to prepare for this. And if you've seen the movie Pearl Harbor, it actually is more about Doolittle's raid than it is about Pearl Harbor, which is weird. But the pilots that were training for that trained in Kansas and then went on these aircraft carriers. And you see it also in the movie that was released just this past year, Midway. You see these bombers taking off of the Yorktown, and it is very difficult. So they take off and then they drop almost down to the sea and then finally pick up and are able to go. But they had enough fuel to get them to Japan. There was no return journey that was planned. Okay, so they were to fly over Japan, drop their bombs on Tokyo, and then continue flying across the East China Sea and land in China, okay, or Korea. That was the plan. And many of them are going to die over the East China Sea. They're going to run out of fuel. Doolittle himself takes part in the raid and actually ends up in China and helps some resistance fighters that are there that are dealing with the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. So it is a crazy plan that comes up, and it made Japan rethink what they were doing. So this idea that we've awakened the sleeping giant, as the admiral said after the Battle of Pearl Harbor, was definitely coming to a head, because they didn't think America had the capability to reach mainland Japan. But the fact that they're able to bomb not only Japan, but the capital of Japan successfully is a major morale blow to Japan, just as Pearl Harbor was a major morale blow to the United States. So Doolittle's raid is an important thing that happens pretty early on there. Then we have the Battle of the Coral Sea. So the Coral Sea is off the coast of Australia, and this is a naval battle. Right? This is a naval battle. And the significance of this battle is that it is the first time in history that ships fought one another without seeing one another. And what that means is that it was fought by aircraft carriers. So it was fought by planes on carriers. So you had the Empire of Japan that was launching their aircraft from about 200 miles away from the American fleet, which was doing the same thing, launching their planes to go after and attack the other fleets. And then, so around these carriers, you have battleships, you have destroyers that are there to protect the carriers, because these carriers are the ultimate weapon of World War II in the Pacific. Okay, just as tanks became incredibly important in Europe, aircraft carriers are the most important thing in the Pacific. And at the beginning of the war, the United States has 3 of them. Okay, only 3. Japan has about 6. So we're massively outnumbered in this. At the beginning of the war, the Japanese planes are better than American planes. We'll see some major development during the war that puts the United States ahead of Japan in that regard later on. But at the beginning of the war, the Zeros that Japan was using were superior planes to the Corsairs that America was using. So, fought by planes on carriers. Then we have the Battle of Midway, and this is another naval battle. So the island of Midway, as we've talked about before, is midway between Hawaii and Japan, or Asia. So it was a very important American point for that. And if you have watched the Battle of Midway, it is about as historically accurate as you can get with a movie, because they actually consulted the Navy, and the Navy helped them design that movie, which is absolutely amazing that they went to the lengths to do that. So if you've got a quarantine movie list, definitely put Midway on there, because it is a fantastic movie that outlines this battle. So it was another planned surprise attack by the Empire of Japan to take this island, but by this time we had started to monitor communications that Japan was doing. So we managed to figure out where their target was and set a trap at Midway. So our carriers had been redirected to go to Midway, but Japan was operating on intelligence that placed the carriers about 200 miles north of where they actually were in the Pacific. So they didn't think that the carriers would play a major part in the first couple waves of the attack on Midway. But because the carriers are there at Midway, this results in a massive defeat for Japan. So this is really kind of the turning point battle in the Pacific, because up until this point, Japan had definitely had an edge. But the significance of this was that 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. So of the 6 carriers that they have in the Pacific, 4 of them are sunk. Additionally, Japan lost 250 planes from those carriers. And this essentially ends Japan's naval superiority in the Pacific. Okay? So ends Japan's naval superiority in the Pacific. So from this point on, just like in Europe, after the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler is fighting a defensive war. From the Battle of Midway on, Japan is fighting a defensive war in the Pacific. Okay. All right. So as far as the map exercise, I'm gonna post the map to the files section, so you'll be able to check that out and answer those 2 questions: which battle was fought the furthest away from the Japanese mainland, which was fought the closest, and then roughly how many miles is Hawaii away from Japan. So you're gonna use the scale at the bottom corner down here. Right, so this scale right here, to figure out what that distance is, and yeah, what are we dealing with here as far as distance with these battles? Okay, so then we have the Allies advancing towards Japan. So after the Battle of Midway, the Allies went on the offensive to liberate the islands in the Pacific. So the strategy that the Allies used was given a nickname of island hopping. Okay, so we're going to conquer one island, and then we're going to use that island to establish air bases to conquer the next island. And then we're going to do the same thing as we work our way westward across the Pacific. So very important that occurs, because the Pacific is a massive, massive ocean, and it's going to be impossible to reach the mainland without having a chain of islands across the Pacific to get to Japan. So another key battle was fought at Guadalcanal, Guadalcanal, Guadalcanal. And what this showed was that after 6 months of fighting, the U.S. finally had a foothold to start island hopping. So Midway was too far away to really start this island hopping situation of using bases, of having naval bases and air bases that you could use to train for, base, and launch the attack on the next island. So taking Guadalcanal is going to help with this. To keep a secret code for communication, the U.S. used Navajo code talkers, Navajo. So this is a really, really interesting story with the Navajo code talkers, because these are a native people that have been put on a reservation in New Mexico that is incredibly desolate, incredibly isolated, is not their ancestral sort of homeland, but nationalism is so strong in the United States, and there was so much threat from Japan that we saw many of these native peoples that have been oppressed by the United States for so long that volunteer and want to help with the war effort. And in Japan, or in the conflict with Japan, one of these tribes, the Navajo tribe, is going to send soldiers whose sole job is to communicate in their native language orders in the field. Okay? So you'd have one Navajo code talker in one unit, and you'd have another Navajo code talker in another unit, and each unit had one code talker that had the radio, and they would communicate with one another, and the Japanese could not figure it out. So for the duration of the war, nobody ever figures out this code, because it is only a spoken language. Okay, it doesn't have a written component, and it is only ever learned through being passed down from generation to generation. Okay, so nobody outside of the Navajo community knew Navajo, which is really, really interesting and really, really useful for the United States. But something that happens with this, and this is really characteristic of the brutal sort of style of fighting that happens in the Asian theater, and that is that you had to protect the code. So because each unit only has one code talker, and they are the only ones that can translate this this code, keeping those guys safe was a ultimate priority. So each code talker essentially had a handler that went around with them everywhere and was ready to do the ultimate sacrifice, that if they were surrounded, if it looked like they were going to be killed or captured, his sole job was to kill the Navajo code talker. Okay? Sole job is to kill the guy that you're probably best friends with, that you rely on for your orders. If all else fails and you're going to be captured, you've got to kill him. Okay? And we do see that happen pretty often. Another way that we see the brutality of the Japanese that are fighting in this way and sort of defending what they believe to be their homeland, this divine wind, is the targeting of medics. Okay, so if you guys recall, if you watch the video on D-Day of Saving Private Ryan, that opening scene, you see the medic, the guys that have the red crosses on their helmets and on their sleeves. As they are working, the Germans kind of let them do their thing, right? They're going to shoot the soldiers they're working on, but they're not going to shoot the actual medics because they're unarmed for the most part. And many American medics in Europe would actually operate on German soldiers that they found that were still alive and wounded before they sent them off to POW camps. In Japan, that was not the case, because the Japanese military actively targeted medics because they knew that if they could kill medics, they were essentially killing 15, 20 soldiers that those medics would then save down the road. So they actively targeted medics. So we start seeing Navy corpsmen stop wearing the red identifiers because it just made them a target in the Pacific. So they are going to be more fully integrated into units and look exactly the same. and that actually saves many of those medics in the Pacific. But the fact that they actively targeted them is something that's pretty crazy. So then by October of 1944, the Allied forces had invaded the Philippines. By March of 1945, they liberated the capital city of Manila, and this essentially marked the return of MacArthur. So he said, "I shall return," and he does in fact return. So the last-ditch effort made by the Japanese was to load up their fighter planes with fuel and explosives and then dive on suicide missions into ships. So this was known as kamikazes. Right? So these are kamikazes. And this is really going to start happening after the Battle of the Philippines. We're going to start seeing Japan essentially get desperate to defend their homeland. So they essentially have these young men that are typically 16 to 18 years old that volunteer for this mission because it was considered to be an honorable death. So we've talked a little bit before about like samurai culture and how that manages to make its way into the modern Japanese military at this time. And that is going to have its final manifestation in the kamikaze pilots. So these were young men that viewed this as the ultimate sacrifice for their country, as the ultimate sacrifice for their emperor, and they were willing to do whatever it took to stop the American advance across the Pacific. So we have close to 100 ships that are sunk by kamikaze pilots. Thousands of men die thanks to kamikaze attacks. And it's a very brutal form of fighting. And even pilots that weren't kamikaze pilots, if they knew that their ship was going, or that their plane was going down, if they didn't have enough fuel to get back to their carrier, it was their job to kill as many Americans as they could before they died. So you'd have basically all planes, if they were damaged, then became kamikaze pilots. So this is something that American soldiers are not really prepared to defend against, but it's something they're going to have to defend against as they move across the Pacific. So this leads us to kind of the two final islands. So Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So why did the U.S. need these two islands? They were super close to mainland Japan. So Iwo Jima is going to be the first of these attacks, and they're going to fight for about a month on this island. And it is a pretty tiny island, comparatively. It's got a massive volcano on it. But that is the only real feature of the island. Everything else is pretty flat. It's got some small shrubberies that are on it. It's got black volcanic soil, the entire island. But the main reason it was important was because there were two airstrips on this island that they needed to take. So when the Americans invaded the island, they initially did not have any resistance. Okay, so they got onto the beaches in their landing craft and started moving inland before the Japanese emerged. And they emerged from underground. Right, so this entire island had tunnels dug all over the place on it. So they emerged and had everything pre-sighted. So they started taking fire from machine guns. They started taking fire from artillery that was stationed on Mount Sarajevo, not Mount Sarajevo. What is the name of the mountain? Mount Cerbiaci. Mount Cerbiaci. I knew it started with an S. So Mount Cerbiaci is going to be the target. So they moved up Mount Cerbiaci, and it's going to take about a week and a half to get up Mount Cerbiaci. And when they got to the top, they raised a flag. Okay? It was just a little flag that the company that made it to the top had. They used some rubble pole that they had found, and it was still an active fighting zone at this time when they raised the first flag. And a admiral on one of the naval ships that was conducting the bombardment still at this point saw that this little bitty flag had been raised on top of Mount Cerviaci. So he was like, we need a bigger flag. So they sent another group of Marines up to the top of Mount Cerviaci with a bigger flag, and a photo crew and a video crew were all there. And that flag raising is the famous flag raising. Okay, and it was completely staged. Right, it was all staged. And it's kind of just by luck that we have that iconic image of the flag raising, because the guy just kind of turned and shot as it was being raised, and he's like, I hope I got it. And takes it back, develops the film, and it becomes the photo of the American effort in World War II. They start using it for propaganda purposes to sell more war bonds. So it is very, very widely distributed, and is one of the most famous photographs of all time, is the raising of the flag on Mount Cerviaci. But it did not mean that there was victory on Iwo Jima, not by a long shot, right? So there's still going to be like 2 more weeks of fighting on Iwo Jima for this tiny little island in the Pacific, okay? And it's going to be very, very brutal fighting, because these soldiers of the Japanese Empire were ready to defend every single inch of Japanese territory with their lives. So their idea was never to surrender, okay? That they were going to keep fighting no matter what. So we actually see many of them committing suicide. So we've talked about ritualistic seppuku before when we talked about samurai. So this idea of suicide being an honorable death, as opposed to being captured, becomes incredibly important for them. So we see one thing that'll happen pretty often is guys will take their last grenade, they'll pull the pin on it, and they'll clutch it to their chest, but to kill themselves before they're captured, right? So we start seeing that happening on Iwo Jima, and it's only going to increase on Okinawa, because unlike Iwo Jima, Okinawa is an ancestral Japanese homeland, right? There are civilians that live on Okinawa. Close to 1 million civilians live on Okinawa, and it is only about 80 miles away from mainland Japan. So defending Okinawa was incredibly important. And they essentially use this as a practice run for this is what fighting on Japan itself is going to be like. And the results were scary. Okay, so I've given you guys a video about some of the fighting on Okinawa and the important elements of Japanese propaganda that were happening with this, because the Japanese knew that their people were going to defend the emperor, defend the empire to their last breath, just the same way as the soldiers did. So on mainland Japan, they actually started training people to fight with sharpened bamboo sticks. They started distributing propaganda that said, don't go to the Americans, because if the Americans find you, they will put you in prison, they will rape you, and they will kill you. Okay? None of those were true. They're not going to put them in prison, they're not going to kill them, and they're definitely not going to rape them, because it was just propaganda that was being used for this. So because of this, the entire Japanese population of Okinawa didn't want Americans there. So they are fighting with the forces in essentially an insurgency that forces American soldiers to have to kill them, because otherwise they would be attacked themselves. So this is very problematic for this invasion with what's going on here. So in about the month of fighting to take Okinawa, America lost about 12,000 soldiers. And this is still a relatively tiny island that we are conquering, right? Going ridgeline by ridgeline, progressively for a month. And again, dealing with these tunnels that are all over the island, and dealing with these suicidal soldiers that are going to defend to their last breath and not surrender. Okay, so they lost 12,000 soldiers in this fight. It is the bloodiest American battle in the war. Okay, And that leads us to the reason why atomic weapons ended the war. So why didn't the U.S. want to invade the mainland of Japan? With this trial run of Okinawa, they realized that an invasion of Japan was going to be incredible in terms of loss of life. Some of the estimates that FDR gets are that we will lose close to 1 million soldiers taking the island. Okay, taking the islands of Japan. And that was something that he didn't want to do. Okay. So what program was set up in 1942 to develop an atomic weapon? That is the Manhattan Project. So in 1942, a group of scientists started experimenting with a new form of weaponry. This is going to be done in Kentucky, I believe. And we've got guys like Oppenheimer is going to be kind of the figurehead within this, that are going to be trying to figure out ways to split the atom. Okay, and by splitting the atom, we're releasing energy. Okay, I think we've talked about what nuclear fission is like. So the splitting of one atom, which leads to those particles going and splitting other atoms, and it's just this massive exchange of energy. Okay, so they are trying to figure out how to do that and how to weaponize that. And in doing this, they develop a weapon. Right. So in 1944, they actually it's early 1945. In like February, they tested the first nuclear weapon, right, in the deserts of New Mexico. They tested this first atomic weapon, and then FDR dies. Okay, FDR dies in April, and then Truman comes into power. Okay, and this weapon was so secret that the Vice President of the United States had no idea that it was happening. Right, the President knew, but the Vice President did not. So once he becomes president, and we've got this trial run that has happened with Okinawa, he's like looking at options for this invasion. Somebody's like, we've got a project. We've got an atomic bomb that we can drop on them. And Truman's like, well, that's great. We can save American lives, and in result save Japanese lives, because Japanese losses are also going to be incredibly high. And it's not just going to be soldiers that are going to be killed. It's going to be civilians that are going to be killed if we take the fight to mainland Japan. So it's sort of a utilitarian perspective, which is what is the best outcome from a numbers standpoint for dealing with a problem, right? So we're thinking about ethics. Utilitarian ethics bring math into the equation, and it's what is the best thing for the most amount of people. Okay, so Truman tells Japan to surrender or be destroyed. Right, so he sends them a message: you can surrender or you can be destroyed. Japan, in response, does nothing. So on August 6th, 1945, the first atomic weapon is loaded into a B-17 Stratofortress called the Enola Gay, or sorry, B-29 Stratofortress called the Enola Gay. It's loaded on there, and this bomb is called Fat Man. Okay, Fat Man. It's a really big bomb, and their target is the industrial town of Hiroshima. 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 So they fly over. It's like a 6-hour mission to get there from Okinawa, and they drop their bomb, turn around, and start heading back to Okinawa. And the bomb drops, and it explodes about 45 seconds later. Okay, 45 seconds it takes to go from super high altitude to where it blows up, which is centered over a couple of bridges in central Hiroshima. Okay, that is a major industrial city. And the bomb explodes, and within 90 seconds, 70,000 people were dead. 90 seconds. Okay, so this atomic weapon creates a flash of light that A, blinds people, B, the heat from that light then starts going through people's body. Okay, we now know that heat was actually radiation that was going through people's bodies. Okay, destroying atoms inside of their body as it's going through them. And this light actually leaves shadows of people, right? So like there's a wall and there's a person standing in front of that wall, and the light hits the person, it doesn't hit the wall behind them. So it leaves the outline of where that person was standing. Okay, and then the whole area around that shadow gets burned to a crisp. Okay, so you have the radiation wave, and then you have an energy wave that comes behind it, which absolutely flattens the city. Okay, there's like very, very few structures that are left standing, and it's only stone structures that are left standing. Everything else, for the most part in Japan, is wooden, so it burns like that. Okay, 70,000 people die within 90 seconds of this thing exploding. Okay, so massive loss of life. After Hiroshima, Truman sends a message to Japan, says, surrender or be destroyed. Japan does nothing. So, 3 days later, August 9th, 1945, Little Man, a plutonium bomb, the first one was a uranium bomb, Little Man is loaded into another B-29 and sent for the city of Nagasaki in a GASAKI, Nagasaki. Same thing happens. Bomb is dropped. This is a slightly smaller city, but it's again an industrial target, right? So it's where war production is happening. And it just happens to be surrounded by a massive amount of civilians. Within 90 seconds of that drop, 40,000 are dead. So in total, we've got about 3 minutes, okay, of total time that these weapons are deployed, and we've seen 110,000 people that are dead. Okay, civilian deaths. 110,000 people. So then, America sends a message to Japan: surrender or be destroyed. And luckily, this time, Japan listens, because if they had not, the next target was Tokyo, the capital. And if that was the case, we would not be talking about tens of thousands of people dead. We would be talking about hundreds of thousands of people being killed in the first 90 seconds. Okay, so August 14th, 1945, Japan surrenders. Okay, it's an unconditional surrender, right? So it's like there's no treaty. There's nothing that goes along with this that we have to sign. It is an unconditional surrender. Okay, we lost. We lost everything with this. So September 2nd, 1945, the USS Missouri sailed into Tokyo Harbor. General Douglas MacArthur is on the battleship, and that is where Emperor Hirohito excuse me. Emperor Hirohito officially signs the unconditional surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri. Now, something that is not talked about very often in history classes is the atrocities of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Because we talk about the Holocaust as being one of the major atrocities in human history, but Japan was doing kind of the same thing in China. But because America is sort of solely responsible for the surrender of the Empire of Japan, we negotiated with them. Right? So Japan had been testing chemical weapons and biological weapons on the people of China, killing hundreds of thousands of people in Manchuria and along the coastlines using these new weapons. And America wanted to know what they were doing. So we essentially made a deal with Japan that said, if you hand over all of your research, all of your materials that you've done with this genocide of the Chinese, we will not try you for war crimes. So because of this, Japan essentially gets off scot-free with all of the crimes against humanity that they did in China, while the Nazis were punished incredibly. Okay, so it is a very selfish thing that happens that America does, because it's with the dropping of the atomic bomb, we see the beginning of the Cold War, right? So it now became, once we have unveiled this new weapon, this atomic weapon that we have, the rest of the world's going to want it, specifically the USSR and Stalin. So it begins this arms race between the United States and the USSR. And because the United States is the ones that accepted Japan's surrender, we want what they know. Okay, so we get all of their weapons technology, things like Agent Orange, things like napalm that they had been testing, and we get to use it in future wars. Okay, and ignored the human atrocities that the Empire of Japan committed because they had given us their research and given us their technologies. So it is a really screwed up thing that happens in American history, and it's something that is often overlooked. Okay, so that concludes today's lecture on Japan. Let me know if you guys have any questions. There's obviously a lot that we didn't cover, because this is again, 3-year-long conflict. So it's kind of impossible to cover it as in depth as I would like to with the time that we have. But if you have questions, let me know. Check out the extra videos and stuff that I posted in today's file. Lots of really interesting stuff in there about the atomic weapons, about the Battle of Okinawa, about Iwo Jima. So definitely look into those. And tomorrow we are going to talk about the war at home, right? So the home front. So I'll see you guys then. Have a